Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Kirklees Local Television's Weekly Wind-Up. I'm Kyle Warwick and joining me this week are Sonia King. Sonia joins us from With Our Voices Raised, an organisation that we will be discussing later in the programme that aims to provide more accountability for MPs. And also joining us is a Weekly Wind-Up resident, David Ridgway. David joins us as a councillor for the Colne Valley from the Liberal Democrats, and he joins us to discuss a standing taxi policy that's been in the news quite a lot recently. That'll be the first topic that we do discuss today. We're looking at the Kirklees Council's new policy that could see taxi drivers suspended if they amass 9 points or more on their licence. This has led to general uproar amongst taxi drivers, which in turn has led to Council Leader Councillor David Sheard to agree that the Kirklees Council's Licensing and Safety Committee should reconsider the 9-point suspension plan. So I'll come to you firstly, Councillor Ridgway. If you could tell me a little bit about what is going into the policy and why you maybe feel that taxi drivers are getting so upset about it.
Well, actually, I don't really understand why the taxi drivers are getting upset, because the policy itself, as now voted on, is that if a driver amasses 9 penalty points on his driving licence or her driving licence, the badge will be suspended until that driver can retake the test which they would have to take to obtain the badge in the first place. There's been a lot of accusation that we're taking jobs away from taxi drivers. Well, my feeling is that if a taxi driver or any driver has amassed 9 penalty points, so those points are all still valid on the licence, they are demonstrating an inability to drive within the normal driving laws. And the travelling public who utilise taxis, I believe, have the absolute requirement that their drivers are driving legally and in an acceptable manner.
And was there any sort of consultation with taxi drivers on the policy?
Massive. I'll take you back. We took the decision in the licensing committee to introduce the 9 points policy in the autumn. There was a 3-month consultation period from November through to February, November 13 through to February 14. And that consultation included the police, the driving organisations, all the taxi driver firms, the unions, the taxi drivers' representations, every single councillor, all the senior officers of the council, and there were 100 documents made available for drivers themselves, 50 in Dewsbury, 50 in Huddersfield. Every single one of those policies were taken away, those documents were taken away, and throughout that 3-month period we received no comments at all. Then we worked up the policy was then presented to the committee debated it, and they voted 9 in favour, 2 against, and so the policy was adopted. Now, that as a consultation I consider to be pretty wide and pretty satisfactory.
How does this compare to the 9-point suspension plan? How does it compare to other drivers who might ferry people in the public, so bus drivers, maybe ambulance drivers?
Well, first bus, if you're a driver with first bus and you get 3 points on your licence, you're automatically suspended. If you're with the police, so I'm led to understand if you're with the police or the ambulance service, you get 3 points on your licence, you're automatically suspended. If you work for Eddie Sobarts, I believe they're quite a large lorry firm, you get 3 points on your licence, you're automatically suspended. And this is a demonstration of those organisations to ensure that their drivers are driving safely and within the law.
Sonia, I'm going to come to you. How do you feel about the 9-point suspension plan? Do you think it's harsh or maybe not harsh enough?
Personally, I think taxis are doing like a public service, like a bus driver. we're entrusting them to get us places safely, and the same rules should apply to taxi drivers as they do to bus drivers.
Yeah. David, the policy has been referred back.
Yep.
What does that mean?
We had a delegation of taxi drivers came into full council in, I think it might have been November, and they made a presentation as to why they felt the policy was harsh. It's interesting that in Bradford City Council, the harshness of the policy is that you get suspended with no opportunity to retake your test if you get 6 penalty points, which is interesting, isn't it? But nevertheless, they felt it was harsh and they asked for it to be reconsidered. I was really quite surprised when the council leader decided that it would be referred back to the committee for rediscussion. But the policy has already been taken into the council's situation. I can't gainsay what the committee will say when we reconsider this in 2 or 3 weeks' time. But I felt it was not the right decision for the council leader to do, because it makes you wonder why we have the committee in the first place.
And if we can go back to the consultation period,
yep,
almost, what was the reaction from the public to the proposed policy, or what is now?
I think the public were in total ignorance of the fact that we were wanting to bring the policy in. I think it's fair to say that people who work in the public arena, like bus drivers, like taxi drivers, like the police, if they are subjected to assault from the public, which taxi drivers are particularly vulnerable as bus drivers are, they receive a degree of additional protection within the court system. That is a benefit which I would consistently support, on the basis that if there's just an ordinary assault between two people, that the punishment is as the punishment is. But if there's an assault of a member of the public on the taxi driver, the punishment could potentially be greater. On the basis of that, I feel that the public has the right to expect its local council to do everything that it can do to ensure that the safety of the travelling public is not affected.
There have been claims in certain circles that this policy discriminates against people of predominantly Asian descent. What would your reaction to that be?
Well, my reaction to that is that a taxi driver is a taxi driver, whether the taxi driver happens to be white, female, Asian, whatever, is, in my view, irrelevant. That person is driving a member of the public, and the member of the public deserves to have the confidence that that driver is safe and driving within the law.
Well, thank you for that. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for on this topic. As always, you can get in contact with the Weekly Wind-Up. You can do so by email, info@kirkleeslocaltv.com, or you can also find us on Twitter by searching @theweeklyWindup. We're going to take a short break now. Please do join us again after the break. Thank you.
Hello
and welcome
to Kirklees
Local Television's
Weekly Wind-Up.
We aim to be informative,
amusing
and provocative.
Now on to our first topic for this week.
Public transport links.
Allotments.
poverty and injustice,
Parking.
Calderdale and Huddersfield hospitals.
FIFA.
discount stores,
Clearer labelling of halal and kosher meat products.
The kidnapping of young girls in Nigeria.
the local authority,
The TV show Come Dine With Me.
And lastly, what is Britishness?
Unfortunately, we've reached the end of today's programme.
But we're not just satisfied with talking to you, we want you to talk back to us.
The weekly wind-up can always be found on email at info@kirkleeslocaltv.com
or on our Twitter page, search @The Weekly Windup.
But please do join us for the next edition on Weekly Windup.
We look forward to you tuning in again next week. Goodbye and thank you for watching.
And welcome back. Joining me this week, Sonia King from With Our Voices Raised, and also joining us is Councillor David Ridgway. Now we're going to speak about the organisation and critical mass crowdfunding project With Our Voices Raised. Welcome, Sonia.
Hi.
I'm going to start. Could you tell us a little bit about With Our Voices Raised and what the aims of the organisation are?
Yeah, basically what we're trying to do is we want to build a website that has that pulls together all the really good things that you see on the internet, like They Work For You, 38 Degrees, the Public Whip website, the parliamentary debate calendar, and make all those things accessible to people at home, so that what happens is you can log onto your computer, you can find your councillor or your MP, you can see what's coming up for debate, you can read what's coming up for debate, you can contact your MP about what's coming up for debate and tell them what you as their constituent want them to do for you. And then what happens is that all feeds back with a feedback system that we want to put in that will make it so that you can then see A, whether your MP listened to you, and B, it would collate the information to see if your MP listened to your constituency as a whole, and or whether they just did what they were told by their whip, or whether they didn't bother turning up at all and abstained. And we want to sort of make that interface to bring politics into the living room and make it more accessible to everyday people like me.
How does crowdfunding play its part in the organisation?
So we have started with nothing but an idea. So we are trying to crowdfund £10,000 to go into towards building our website. We are also applying for grants. I'm in the process of applying for a Joseph Rowntree Foundation grant to help pay for that. The crowdfunding itself is just to pay towards the building of the website, whereas the grants we want to then be able to provide staff.
How do you feel increased accountability could affect politics and politicians?
Firstly, I think people need to feel involved. We're reaching a sort of point in politics at the moment where there is a lot more involvement, especially after the Scottish independence referendum, and people want to be heard. They want to join in what's going on around them. You have all the people wanting the sort of brand type revolution, saying there's nothing for us, and we want to sort of be able to say to those people, yes, there is. It's here. We want to challenge the voter apathy that comes with feeling like you haven't got a voice, because a lot of apathy doesn't come from not caring, it comes from feeling like you can't change anything, and we want to make it possible to change things. But on the flip side, people often find it hard to talk to their MPs or councillors because there is a sort of language barrier in the way, especially the way things happen in the House of Commons and the way people talk and the way things are discussed, and especially the paperwork. And it's not accessible to people, it's not in the way they would speak and understand, and we want to almost translate between members of the public and their representatives.
Absolutely. Councillor Ridgway, I'm going to come to you. More accountability for councillors, how would you feel about that?
The ultimate accountability for any elected person is the subsequent election, when the public have the right to either re-elect or to boot the individual out. I'm actually very interested in the desire to have the individual person's voice heard, because that ultimately is what politics is all about. And I was just wondering how angry that individual person will be, having gone through the process, whether it's your process or any other process, of getting in touch with your elected person and putting your point of view with which the elected person doesn't agree. And if the elected person doesn't agree with your point of view, have you been heard or not heard? And if that person then goes into, if that elected person then goes into a debate and your point of view is not put forward, have you been heard or not heard? Well, if you've actually had the direct conversation with that elected person, you obviously have been heard. But if your argument has been rejected, it's been rejected. And how do you feel about that? Obviously not too good. So I think there are issues which have to be carefully assessed and taken into the thought process on both sides. I actually think that your process is quite exciting. I think it's also quite, from my point of view, quite daunting, and also probably quite frightening in a way. And I do just wonder whether it will encourage more people to get involved at the sharp end of actually getting elected, or whether it'll actually turn people off and push them away. Interesting thought processes. All part of your elbow.
I mean, there's maybe a sense now that for people to actually get their voices heard, there has to be a certain level of vitriol to almost, quite the most extreme point of view gets heard because it's put across most loudly. Do you not feel this would allow people who are maybe not apathetic as such, but not as angry, to make their voices heard as well?
Public anger is a very interesting concept. In years gone by, of course, it turned out into riot, and we had Riots Acts to stop people having riots. The loudest voice gets heard the most. The loudest voice is often the voice which you shouldn't be listening to at all. We've had Holocaust Day yesterday, and if we listened to the voices that were being raised by the suppressed communities in Germany in the 1930s, there will be no Holocaust Day today. But there wasn't that degree of anger. In fact, from what I read in my history books, there was more a degree of concern that if we got involved, we'd only go back to the bad days of the Great War. And indeed, ultimately, we went back to the bad days of the Great War and had an even worse situation. So, should we listen? We should always listen. Should there be dialogue? There should always be dialogue. Should elected people be allowed to hide away in their palaces? It's not necessarily the right word. Well, I suppose it's the Palace of Westminster, the Palace of Kirklees Council. Should they hide away? No, they shouldn't. Should they go out and engage with their electorate? Yes, they should. Can they engage with all their electorate? Obviously not. Mr. Miliband's going to talk to 4 million people, but there's 60, 70 million electors. So which 4 million are the lucky people chosen by him to go and be talked to? I hope it's not me.
I mean, it does, when you read it, I think it's 30,000 people a day that he needs to speak to before the election. He's got a job on.
He'll be losing weight.
But I'll come back to you now, Sonia.
Okay.
Is this purely a local scheme, or will it be a national scheme as well?
The idea is to roll it out nationally first, because the information to do things on an MP level is already readily available. The coding's already there. It's a much easier process to set it up on a national basis. The next phase, the bit I'm really excited about, is the local arena. So you would have what's coming up for debate in your local council, what decisions are going to be made locally, and people can access that and then communicate more with their local councillors, who they might not even know who they are, and they can then communicate with them, and then they can find out not just whether they listen to them, but whether they listen to the majority, which is the key point here. I mean, if you think about Monday's infrastructure bill, how many people wanted the moratorium? I can't even say the word, but they wanted that to be voted for, and it wasn't. And I read the infrastructure bill, and I could not understand a word of it. I managed to pick out the bits that were relevant to the things that affect me. But we really need someone who can go through these massive documents that make no sense to anybody, write them in English, show you them and say, what do you think to this? This affects you and your family, and people to be able to say, oh, actually, I really don't want that to happen. And if you collate all the people that said they didn't want that to happen, that is a huge number, and hundreds of MPs just ignored their constituents. Not ours, actually, which was quite refreshing. But we feel like that needs to be put an end to.
Yeah. And finally, how can people who are interested with Our Voices Raised, how can they get involved?
So there's a number of ways you could get involved. You can either follow us on Twitter, find us on Facebook. We have got a crowdfund campaign running for the next 33 days. It's at Critical Mass. And also volunteers, if anyone wants to volunteer to do, and there are a number of volunteer roles on the Critical Mass page. There will be more volunteer roles. Just talk about us. Tell your friends. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much. Now on to our final topic. There has been much controversy in recent weeks around the proposed leaders' debates. Firstly, there was upset around the decision to exclude the Green Party from the debates. This led to David Cameron stating that he would not take part should the Greens be excluded. Now the BBC and ITV have decided to include the Green Party as well as the SNP and Plaid Cymru. This has led to Peter Robinson, leader of the Northern Ireland's Democratic Union Party, to tweet that he will be writing to the BBC and ITV to ask why his party are excluded. The live television debates are now a new addition to the British political process, having been introduced in 2010. David, I'm going to come to you. Do you, and if you do, why do you feel that the debates are an important part of the process?
Well, I thought the debates in 2010 were absolutely fascinating. My little party, my little cliquey little party, the Liberal Democrats, suddenly got a massive amount of television coverage with a new phenomenon called I Agree with Nick. And I hope it was Nick Clegg rather than Nick Griffin. I suppose some agree with Nick Griffin, but not many people in the BNP do now. And why are they excluded? I mean, is this open democracy or not? Do I think they're important? Yes, I think they do, because I think they give an opportunity for the public to see the potential prime ministers of the country dealing with ordinary people's questions at a time when they can make a choice as to whether this one or that one becomes the Prime Minister. Yeah.
Is that something you agree with, Sonia?
I agree the debates are important. It is, people are entitled to make an informed choice about who is in charge of the country. Personally, for me, I feel like party politics itself needs to be broken down more anyway, and that if you're going to do debates about the country as a whole, why not do local ones too? Have your local councillors and see what's not necessarily your local councillors but your local MPs, and see what you're voting for in your area, because this whole party politics it's not going to work anymore. There's so many different parties, we should have a rainbow, in my opinion, a rainbow of people, and we should all work
alliance
together. Yeah.
With the spiralling...
You put all the whips out of work.
Well, that's possibly not a bad thing.
With the spiralling number of parties involved in the debates now, do you not feel there might be a risk of any answers of substance being watered down to soundbites and slogans? And if that is the case, who do you feel will benefit from that? I
think you just described party politics as it stands at the moment, personally. It's all sound bites. Yeah.
Sadly, I think you're absolutely right. And I do feel that if there are 7 party leaders, potentially 8, maybe 9, it will become broadly farcical. I think this is a system which works exceptionally well in America, because there are, broadly speaking, 2 parties, sometimes there are 3. But over here, the 2-party system is broken, has been broken, it's been broken for a long time now. And it's an interesting concept, but the parties need to be broken down even further. Well, you're absolutely right. You have got in the Conservative Party pro-Europeans, anti-Europeans, and we don't care about Europe anyway because it doesn't bother us because we're not involved. In the Lib Dems, surprisingly, you've got anti-Europeans. There's an anti-European member of Parliament. who's actually not seeking re-election this time. You've got pro-Europeans, you've got pro-environmentalists, you've got anti-environmentalists. In the Greens break themselves down into pro-business, anti-business, pro-environment. Yes, we'll talk about the environment because it's good for our image. You've got in the Labour Party, you've got every single colour of the rainbow right across, and yet they've formulated themselves into these parties in order for their own specific convenience. Historically, very strong. For the future, interesting.
Interesting times.
Interesting.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Well, that is all we have time for today's programmes. I'd like to thank my guests for joining me today. As always, you can contact the Weekly Wind-Up. You can do so by email, info@kirkleeslocaltv.com. You can also find us on Twitter by searching @The Weekly Wind-Up. Please do join us again for another edition of The Weekly Wind-Up. Thank you and goodbye.